Well, cheers
Cheers. Yes,
to
please.
tea to tea
And I'm
drinking.
to tea drinking, and I'm a Green Mountain State cup. This was a
Nice.
beautiful mug that I was given. Um, are you drinking tea also? That if we're both drinking tea, that's we are being as stereotypical as possible,
Yeah.
despite not living in England. So first initial question I would have for you is when you what was that decision for you to leave England? Because people often ask me. In fact, I was at a training yesterday where I was teaching some educators in a school how to belay, and someone asked me like, "Why did you leave England?" What's your answer to that question?
Good question. I mean, when I initially left England, it was because I just wanted to have access to bigger mountains. That was my only focus, is like I had done quite a lot of climbing in the UK, and I felt like I'd not explored everything by that point. I was only kind of 19. But I definitely had a yearning for like bigger mountains, and the Alps just seemed like an obvious choice. And
Mm.
Chamonix also seemed like an obvious choice because I had people out here who lived out here already, and I could kind of get slotted in with them. So it was kind of cool.
Yeah, what was that? There's a transition at some point where you leave and then you make that decision not to go back. What was that for you? How did you decide like, right, I'm gonna lock in?
I did a winter season first, and I'd never really skied before, and I was really passionate about learning to ski. So I kind of spent a whole winter out in Chamonix learning to ski. And then I really wanted to spend the summer out in Chamonix, but a couple of things transpired that basically meant that I had to go back to the UK and go and do like a summer back in the UK. And that was kind of fun. I was basically just kind of bumming around being a climber and doing odd jobs like window cleaning and various things like that, and actually ended up getting a random job out in the Dolomites that summer
Mm.
as a Via Ferrata guide, which back then was kind of a thing that you could go and take people on Via Ferratas without being a full IFMGA guide. And I did that for the summer, realized that I had a lot of passion for, exploring the Alps and everything that was involved in the Alps. And that was when I realized that I had to go back in the winter again and like give it a proper go and like actually make sure that I lined up staying out for the next summer, because I just was having more fun over in the Alps. So
Yeah, I it typically it ends up, I've interviewed now probably something close to 100 different adventure professionals in different ways, and um, I like to ask, and I actually wrote an article for Adventure Park Insider magazine on this idea of career paths. How do you actually make this a career? Because for me, it was like I came to the States, found out that I could teach the stuff that I'm doing now. So, but I didn't know it was a career necessarily. I kind of like fell into it. Um, More than likely, you've probably experienced because you may have had moments where you were a participant in guided programming in the mountains. What was what advice would you give, let's say, to the newer professionals coming in of what's the drive for you? What do you consider essential qualities if you want to make it as a career? Because you did all those odd jobs. I also did a load of seasonal work here in the US. So, but what would you consider the priorities there?
I'd say your main priority is that you want to spend lots of time outside, and that you also want to be very physically active. So I know a lot of guides who are very restless, and they're very, they have to be moving all the time, and they just like to be outside, and they only find kind of peace and stillness when they've been out doing stuff all day, and they're tired, and they sort of feel like they deserve that comfort in the evening. And I think that's very true for me. Is like I like to feel like I've done something with my day. I like to
Mm.
feel like I've been out and like had a good experience, and then at the end of the day I feel like I've earned that beer or cup of tea, or sitting on the couch and watching a film or something. But I think you have to have that kind of you want to be a kind of person who wants to be outside and wants to be really active. But I think most people who kind of lead into a career in the outdoors generally are.
Mm.
You know, if you just kind of dream about it, but you haven't actually like properly experienced that, then I would just encourage people to like actually go and experience that lifestyle of, you know, it being a climbing bum or being a skiing bum or something, you know, where you actually are just like fully immersed in it and make sure that your passion is true and it's there, you know. That's yeah, take a moment to immerse yourself would be my advice. And then from that you'll know if it's for you or not.
Yeah, I there are two thoughts that come into mind as you were saying this. One was the um, finding something that you enjoy and being able to pursue that and with passion and intent. The other thing that you mentioned is the physicality piece. There is, you need to be physically active in order to do some of the work. And yeah, I'm considering this. I'm 38 now, and I actually have some lower lumbar concerns, and so I've been really more prioritizing my physicality, or the how do I maintain that physicality moving forward. And what I've started to note and teach to is I'd say in belaying, I'm talking about physicality in terms of my stance and my posture and the mechanics. And when I started off younger, I didn't really care about that so much. I was doing the actions and performing the task, but I wasn't considering how do I maintain that. Is that something that you are considering as you continue in this career? Or, my mathematics would say you're probably in your 30s. So as you continue in this career, um, do you consider the physicality of the job, and how do you maintain that physicality?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I consider a lot. I try and listen to my body. I try and spend a lot of time on, you know, maintaining strength and fitness and flexibility to a certain degree. I don't spend that much time on flexibility actually. I generally find that like baseline, I'm flexible enough, and um, I don't necessarily believe that you need to be ultra flexible to be you know, a mountain sports professional. I think actually you could actually go the wrong way and be too flexible in some ways. Um, and Yeah, I just spend a lot of time making sure that I'm listening to my body. Am I too tired? You know, is this the right thing to be doing? I also try to make sure that I'm aware of that whilst I'm in the middle of a really busy guiding season, for example.
Mm.
So, you know, I think quite often guides fall trap to doing too much work, and that can kind of lead them down this avenue of being like too tired. So and then, you know, that can kind of lead to sickness, or it could lead to injury. Um, and I think for me, I try and listen to that quite a lot. And if I feel like I'm going down that road, then I will try and just have a day off when it makes sense. You know, if there's a rainy day, for example, in the middle of the winter where you don't really want to be skiing because it's raining,
Hmm.
you know, I just cancel the work and, you know, refund the clients, and I take that hit, you know. And I think clients generally appreciate that because they don't want to go skiing in the rain either. So
It's funny. It's like there's a lot of people will ask us like, can you still run programming in bad weather? And there's a lot of times where I'll say from a risk management perspective, there is of course certain weather conditions that you can operate in, but I'm of the same mindset. Like if I'm not enjoying it, they're probably not enjoying it. So it's like, all
yeah,
right, do I really want to actually do that though? Um, the other thing you mentioned is you referenced the almost like the colloquial terms of like a ski bum or a climbing bum. Um, Something that I consider, because I'm always considering as well, like how do we bring in new people, new young professionals into the field? How do we get them excited, knowing that there's seasonal work around them? Do you? What's your thoughts on like this is overly philosophical maybe, but what's your thoughts on the way that the outside world perceives the work that we do? Do you feel like they lump us into that kind of bum, attitude? And yet, I think my assumption is both you and me. I know that for me, I take my work very seriously, even though I know that it's really, really fun and engaging. Sometimes when I hear those terms, I kind of like, how do we move beyond that? So I've said a lot there, so I'll let you jump in wherever I've dropped it. But
Yeah, I think you could think about that in a way that climbing and ski mountaineering and or backcountry skiing even is quite they're quite new sports still. Climbing has been around essentially for a long time, but it's only really in the last several decades that technological advances and testing and people are really paying a lot more attention to techniques and how to do things. That's really kind of like it's like a hockey stick effect. It's kind of like I was like, yeah, just whatever, and now it's kind of like people are really paying attention to it a lot more. And I think as climbing expands and things like the Olympics are helping the climbing world to expand, and the proliferation of more climbing gyms in cities and things like that are making climbing expand, and people are then, as they get enthusiastic into things, you see them starting to branch out and do rock climbing and then multi-pitch climbing, and then out, and they want to get into the Alps and do alpine climbing, or do routes in North America, or whatever. I think as that expands, the sort of the professionalism within it will have to match it, and I think that the outside perception at the moment isn't necessarily matching up with the way that professionals treat their work. The outside perception is, sort of a mountain guide, or you're an instructor or something. You're just like you are like a climbing bum or whatever. And it's like, no, I take my work incredibly seriously. Especially when it comes to delivering courses to people that empower them to take on dangerous tasks or dangerous situations without supervision. So I think, I feel like within guiding, you're often just tied to somebody and you're sort of leading them up a mountain, and they're not really dealing with the any of the thought process around that. But then, a large part of being a guide is also instructing people. We're supposed to be able to do both, and we are able to do both at the highest level, I would say. That when you're instructing somebody, you should be able to think about what they need to learn so that they can kind of head out there and do it by themselves. And if you don't take that really, really seriously, but you are in the profession of doing it, then I think you really need to sort of check yourself and just think, is the information that I'm giving somebody empowering them to take more risks? And if it is, then I need to make sure that the information that I'm giving them is the best, and also balanced as well. Like I feel that a lot of the time when I'm doing like tutorials online, YouTube or Instagram or whatever, there's many different ways of doing things, and in a 60-second reel you can only show somebody so much and talk about so much in that, and quite often you're not showing a balanced opinion about, well, you could do it like this, or you could do it like this, and there's pros and cons of both. You don't really have time, so I try and focus a little bit more on, okay, this is the best way, or this is a really universal way of doing something. And then you will get comments from people saying, oh, you could also do it like this. And yeah, it's great to have that discussion, and if people are reading those discussions, then that's great. I strongly encourage that. But yeah, it's interesting being part of that world.
yeah, and I would say something that I'm particularly passionate about is I kind of consider myself and people of the same age as myself, like this, with this newer generation of adventure professionals, and I butt up against, as probably you do, also people who have been doing this longer than we are. We have maybe even been alive. That term sometimes gets brought up, like, oh, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, and it's that conversation, that balance of saying, yeah, we understand the way it used to be done. I can take in that information. let's say as an example, I'll use an example that maybe listeners will be familiar with. Let's say hands up belaying, which in the US gets called slip, slap, slide. And then we've got maybe hands down belaying, gets referred to as the P bus, the pull, break, under, slide, or it might be in England it could be V to the knee, 1, 2, 3. There lots of different versions of hands down belaying. But if you've been doing something a certain amount of time, then sometimes you can get really stuck into that's the right way to do it, and that's the thing that I find hard. In fact, I'll give you an insight. Like the two hardest people I find to train are those who have been doing it a long time and haven't had some formalized training in quite some time, and then younger, newer people coming in who have only been taught by their friends. And both of those, I think, have issues because they've got very limited or very concrete information, and they're unable to see that balance that you're suggesting. So when you put something out on YouTube, that's what those people are more likely the people who are commenting. When I see people comment who are like, no, that's not the right way to do it, they're very adamant. I don't think the breadth of their information is that broad. So how do you? I don't know. Feels another philosophical. How do we solve that curve? Is it just persistence? Is it trying to meet them where they're at in that moment? From an education perspective, how do you help those people? Because I know they're the hardest. I know my strategy, but what's your strategy if you interact with those people?
Do you mean like the people who are the newer people or the older people that are more stuck in their ways?
Let's
Because I
let's
would,
let's go. Yeah, let's go for both. Pick one, and then we'll do the other. But yeah, I
yeah.
understand those are different. Yeah.
I'll start. I'll start more, maybe more with the sort of more experienced people who are stuck in their ways, because I think that's interesting. That is an interesting kind of problem that the entire outdoor community can face. You know, if people aren't keeping up with their kind of continued professional development, within guiding, you have to do a certain amount of continued professional development, but you can also pick and choose what that is to a certain degree. So for example, in the British Mountain Guide system, we have a CPD system, and you sort of choose courses that you do. You have to do a minimum of 1 day per year or 2 days every 2 years, whatever it is, and you keep on top of these point systems. But you have a selection of courses that you can choose, anything from like learning about rope construction to bolting, to rescue situations, or you can pick and choose what you do. And if you're very focused on one direction, then it might mean that you're not necessarily opening yourself up to doing these other topics and keeping up with those. And then if you also work in isolation, or if you're an older person like stuck in your ways, you might also be in isolation. You might have a very small group of friends that you climb with who all do it the same way, and you could be. I generally find that older people are more closed off to having like conversations about how to do things better, because especially from some young blonde upstart like me. So I don't know. I try to engage in people in conversations if I feel like they want to, but I don't like to sort of force things down, force things on people. They can make their own decisions, and if it's worked for them, it's worked for them. Great, but I just generally encourage those people to just kind of like be a little bit more open minded to how things evolve, and that climbing it's one of these things where people learn, they find these new ways of doing things, and then they share it with people online. That's basically how it works, and how we've globally got to where we are, is sharing information online. So I just think it's important for those people to kind of keep up with that a little bit. But on the flip side, when you're talking about younger people coming in and they've seen lots of information from certain sources on the internet, being told, this is one particular way of, this is how you do it. This is, okay, right, yeah, that's how you do it. Okay, and then it's about, for those people, it's about opening their their vision a little bit, that there are other ways of doing things, and there are pros and cons to all these different ways of doing things. And you know, but when you teach a beginner, you have to basically teach them the best way to do things. I mean, if I was to give you a beginner climber, you would teach them what you feel is to be the best way to do things, and then you would let them, as they progress, go down their own road of figuring things out. I can't give you a good
Yeah.
example right now, but let's say tying into the end of the rope. When I was taught to tie into the end of the rope, I was taught to tie in with a stopper knot as well, right?
Hmm.
These days, it's widely regarded that you don't need to use a stopper knot to tie in, right? There is still people who like to tie in with a stopper knot. And I'd see that there are some benefits to tying in and using a stopper knot. For example, if you are building trad belays in the UK and you're cyclically loading the figure of eight loop in the belay, and you're pulling the figure of eight apart potentially because you've incorporated it into your belay system, I would certainly feel a lot better having a stopper knot there that would stop that figure of eight from rolling if it was pulled in the wrong way. So saying that it's not important is like, well, okay, it's maybe not important if you're sport climbing, but it could be important for other things, So it's just about kind of opening those people's vision a little bit more and letting them see that there is other ways to do things and pros and cons of everything, and then about giving them the tools to make their own decisions. So.
And I think that's a really critical point that you sort of suggested there. And it's like it's giving them the right information for the scenario they're in at that moment, and being very clear that they may interact with other ones. But I think the key thing is giving that rationale and giving the why behind it. The argument I always find, and I think that you talk about the education point, needing to take that seriously. And I would say, it's a bit of a joke that like teachers teach because they can't do, like that idea of like the educator being less than. But I consider in our industry, actually, the educator is far more critical and far more discerning than the practitioner, than the one that can't do that, because we have to have that broader scale of idea that you're giving them the why. And it's not like, oh, if someone if let's say you taught someone and someone challenged them after the fact you've taught them, and then their response to why they do it is, well, I do it because Dave told me. That is never, from my perspective, enough, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't want it to be like, hey, why do you do this? Well, Phil showed me this and that's why it's done. No, I want you to know why. So I try to be very intentional. As an example, in the work that I do around challenge courses and ropes courses, when I'm belaying on that, because of for our reasoning, we actually will tie the stopper. We call it a finishing knot, but the purpose that we would tie that would actually not be even the shock loading or the potential roll of the knot, the primary knot. It's actually to manage the tail. We've had cases here in the US of corneal scratches from the melted end smacking people in the eyes on climbers because the belay action has been quite abrupt. So we actually teach that for tail management, which is once again a different mindset, but it's just that as long as we have the rationale and the why. But
It's a balancing act though with a beginner, isn't it, to give them enough information versus too much.
oh
And
yeah.
that really, that's kind of the crux of it when you're teaching somebody how to do something like this. Is there's so much that goes into climbing that if you spend too long kind of laboring the point about should you tie a stopper knot or not, people just kind of like phase out and they're just like, well, can I just get on with some climbing? And I want to learn all these other things that need to be learned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I think, but yeah, I think like challenging people is good. Generally when I meet a new climber and I'm like, they've done some climbing and I'm like taking them to the next level, let's say, like I've been running some skills courses recently, which is like multi-pitch rescue and problem solving, which I find
Mm-hmm.
really interesting because actually there's a heck of a lot of people out there that do multi-pitch sport climbing who don't have any idea how to like lower somebody with in plaquette mode, or how to haul somebody, or how to escape the system, or any number of things, like any number of problems that you could face within multi-pitch climbing. And I sort of watch what they're doing to start with, and then ask them a bunch of questions about why. And a lot of them just don't have that why because they haven't thought about it enough. And then I just encourage them to like get the why behind everything. Get, why am I doing it like this? Why am I putting the wire loop of the plaquette device against the rock versus on the outside of the rock? Or should I be doing it the other way around? What's the pros and cons of all these things, and start to dive into that, and don't get too bogged down in it as well. Find what makes sense, and stick with that. If somebody kind of raises something else, be open to talking to them and changing it, because at that point you might be more at the other end of the spectrum, which is that kind of experienced person who's very closed off to learning. And I try not to be that person. I try to be very open. If I post something, for example, and somebody says, well, actually, you should do it like this, I go, okay, all right, I'm gonna try it out. I'm actually going to try out what you're saying, and I'm going to figure out for myself the pros and cons, and then I'm going to get back to you, or I'm going to talk about that more, and that's how I figure it out. And that's how I make sure that I'm on the right track with what I'm doing and what I'm teaching. So I love figuring out new, better ways to teach as well. And I think, probably 4 or 5 years ago, my ability to teach was quite limited, and I feel like it's getting a lot better now. And I still think there's a lot more that I can improve upon as well. And that is what keeps me engaged and excited about it as well, is figuring out better processes to teach people. Yeah.
What in that 4 to 5 years, what has been that growth for you? What have you realized what do you do now better than you did 4 years ago when it comes to your teaching?
Good question. I think I'm probably better at identifying where people are at now than I was before, and quickly finding the thing that they need to learn next. That's quite an important part of where we operate as guides, I think, because quite often we're teaching on the fly. We're sort of doing some kind of objective whilst trying to impart some teachings, or provide learning experiences along the way. So being able to quickly identify where somebody's at and give them the next piece of the puzzle to work on is a good thing to have. So I'd say that's improved quite a lot. Yeah, I don't know really. I also think that I've spent quite a lot of time over the last few years really diving into the technicality of lots of different things, and actually trying out a whole bunch of new things and being very critical of the ways that I've been doing it. So just having that experience of kind of like diving into all these different techniques and trying them out, and pushing them and all these kind of things, that really helps you to kind of like give people a lot clearer of a vision of like, this is why I'm teaching you this thing. I take an example, like, have you read Andy Kirkpatrick's book Down?
No, I haven't. No,
you haven't. I'd recommend looking at it if you are into climbing, and in fact anybody who's into any kind of multi-pitch climbing, there's definitely information in there that would be really useful. And if you're really heavily into like alpine climbing, the whole book is just well worth a read. It's really, really good stuff. There's a couple of things in there that I'm like, yeah, I don't think I would teach people how to do that, or I wouldn't teach them how to do it like that. I would teach them how to do it like this. But for example, in that book, there's, I think, 5 or 6 different ways that are listed out of how you can release a plaquette belay device whilst it's loaded and it can't be unloaded, and you can lower somebody down. So there's 5 or 6 different ways of doing it that are all very clearly laid out in that book, with also some of the pros and cons of both. And I've tried to like dive into all of those and try them all out and figure out which I think is best and why, and then start teach that. But then also, if students then want to dive into the other methods and why I don't think those are better, we can do that as well, or how it might be different, or different scenarios might call for doing it in different ways. But it's so, I mean, that subject is just like, it's one of these things that you might need to do once in your climbing career. It's like, you don't need to spend 2 weeks learning it. You need to kind of get it in the toolbox, and kind of make sure it stays in the toolbox. That's kind of what I try and frame these things to students as tools. Some tools are really small, and you just kind of, oh yeah, that tool, I could put that in the toolbox. I might use that at some point. Some tools you use all the time, tying into the end of a rope, like threading a belay device, whatever, like how you do things. It's like your hammer or your whatever. You use it all the time, and it's right there at the top of the toolbox, and you're very familiar with it and how it feels and all this kind of stuff. And then you have some bigger tools, like, in the toolbox, which are really complex, and they have all these knobs and dials, and you need to like, and you're like, wow, I have no idea how to use these knobs and dials and how to figure all this stuff out. But if you can figure out how that big tool works, then you know that when you need to use it, it's ready to be used. So that's kind of how I frame it to people. I don't know if you like that analogy or not, but
tough if
it
I
seems,
don't.
yeah.
No, I like it. No, I like the analogy.
It's my analogy. So that's what I use. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do like it. I like the idea of like these are a set of tools that you're using, and I agree with the notion of like being able to access them when necessary, and I think it comes accumulative through your career. I That's where I think like for newer people, it's you're teaching them what's necessary, what tools are needed in the moment, and repetitively so. And then once people get more accustomed to that, then you can start adding in new things, because I think otherwise, once you get it just can feel overwhelming. But it shouldn't be that we disregard then those things that we might use minimally, because
Mm.
I've operated. We do an advanced technical workshop, which is all about lowering people and dealing with non-normal scenarios. That's the way I kind of frame them. But people will sometimes challenge them, like, "Why do we do this? Why are you teaching this if it's never really going to come up for me?" And it's like, well, I understand that, but I've also led and taught wilderness first responder classes, and I've taught people how to deliver babies in the woods. But it's not like we'll never use those things. It's when you might need them, how might you
Mm.
use them? And I think that knowing how to do those things too gives greater confidence to those more basic skills, those more repetitive skills, and it just reinforms them, and it kind of informs them. I think the idea of understanding friction continuums as an example of like understanding the different amount of friction that different things, Prusik versus Klemheis and all these components, I think those are really helpful. Then when you make decisions, you can understand the parameters around them. And I think that I only see that as a benefit to add on, rather than saying, I just need to know the stuff that I'm going to use every day. And
Yeah.
I think that's a limiting point of view. Um,
Yeah.
Let me ask you that. I'm going to go into something very specific now, and it kind of aligns with what we've talked about having good conversations, critical conversations between opinions. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I recently watched one of your videos and I saw something that I disagreed with.
Mm.
So I'm bringing this up to say, like, oh, I mean, well, let's talk about it. Um, the general parameters are the dressing of knots. All right. and whether or not we actually consider those important or not. And I'm not using that as a pun. Um, in your recent YouTube video, you talked about bends, connecting two ends, and you demonstrated the double fisherman's. My challenge is that your double fisherman's wasn't dressed, and
Mm.
so I'm gonna show you. I've got a prop here, and
Oh,
so in this
beautiful.
version, the X's are lined up, right? The tails are on opposite ends, and then when you turn it around, you've got all four. Yours had an X on one side and X on the other. The tails are on the same side. Now, this is my challenge. Is that important? That's my overall question. Is the dressing of these kind of knots, does it serve a purpose or not? You can read in different ways that it reduces the strength of a knot by 10% if it's undressed. All of this stuff out there. I'm asking you, what's your thought on that?
Um, Good question. I mean, if that 10% that if that 10% is the correct number that, dressing and not correctly reduces it by, then what I would say is, okay, um, are you going to be operating anywhere close to needing that 10%?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if you're not operating anywhere close to needing that 10% of extra strength, is this something that you need to spend a lot of time, uh, figuring out and making it perfect in that regard? You can make your own decision, I think. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think your knot there that you showed me was beautiful. I loved it. That was great. Um, I think people can get overly worried sometimes about
Mm-hmm.
doing things to absolute perfection, whereas probably the way that I did it was actually going to be totally fine for any application that you could think of within climbing, which is probably why I didn't spend time making it perfect. But maybe there are other situations where that dressing is a lot more important. I did a recent I did a recent video as well about alpine butterflies. I didn't realize that there was two ways that you could kind of make a knot that looks like an alpine butterfly. But yeah, I realized that I I had been tying an alpine butterfly incorrectly. I was like, oh, okay, wow, yeah, great. I just learned something brilliant. And rather than being kind of embarrassed by that, I tried to just be like, okay, great. I now have like more knowledge and parameters that when I teach this, I can sort of, that's great. That's a positive thing. It's like, wow, I've just learned something. And I would like to also dive into whether dressing a double fisherman is that important, because I want to know that as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, these little details, I think they are important, but I would encourage people to not get too dragged down in those details as well. But if it's, yeah, I don't know. I remember having a discussion with somebody who was sort of telling me that the figure of eight that I tied was like the wrong way round. The
Yeah.
load strand wasn't the right side of where it goes
Mm-hmm.
in, and I was like, I'm sorry, but it's it is. It's just you're not seeing it properly. Don't worry. Like, I know it's fine. Don't worry. But I think, yeah, that sometimes watching things on the internet as well, you don't see everything, or it's hard to like to get everything. But yeah, what I'd like you to do is rewatch some climbing competitions with the world's best climbers, but shift your focus to the knots that they've tied in with.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And you'll be like, oh, okay, yeah. Their
Mm-hmm.
focus is not on how they've tied their knot, and they're taking huge falls. They're
Mm-hmm.
not thinking about their knot. They're not getting worried about their knot. And a lot of the time they're not properly dressed. They're not properly tightened. They're not. The tail is too long. The loop is too big. All these kind of like things that you could
Mm-hmm.
come back to saying this is not a perfect knot. They kind of have. They just don't care. They're just like, I need to focus on the climbing. And I would encourage people to remember that as well. It's nice to learn how to do things properly from the start and really get focused on doing it, and spend the time to like do it properly from the start, and continue that through your climbing career, because then you don't have to think about it ever again. If you've built those really good habits from the start and you understand what is good, then you don't have to ever think about it again, because it just happens naturally. But spending ages kind of like fighting against other people that you're not doing it right, it's like they might not care about this. So
Yeah.
they're
And
still climbing. So
yeah, and I would say like something as possibly something that you and I or the new generation, maybe the educators, and we can only have so much touch points, right? Like we're only interacting with the people that we're interacting with as guides. You're in YouTube and then on Instagram are being able to reach more people, and it's almost like the Spider-Man quote: "With great power comes great responsibility." And then as we start to interact, we have the capacity of maybe um, reducing the amount of reworking and reteaching that people have to learn if they can learn those basics well, why demonstrating those basics initially well, and possibly why those people are tying knots not in the perfect, and I'm using air quotes there, way, is that they were taught by their buddies on the rock because that was the way that's how they learned it. There was no formalized, as we sort of suggested at the start. You don't have to go far back where there was not formalized education in this and standardization and all of those kind of things that we're interacting with. That's why there's that generation. I think that the newer generation coming through has access kind of increases as popularity increases, as Olympic sports they're recognized, as climbing gym influx, as we're starting to see that boom has started to come into play, and we see different technology. I have issues with auto belay stuff, but that's my own hang up, and we have those kind of things happening. I think we do have a responsibility to ensure that at the basic level, the initial stuff is accurate, so that there's not that relearning as we go on. But then we can also have that lens, I think, which is important, is what truly matters. And there's that priority that we have to align ourselves with. And getting nitpicky is not necessarily the priority, but then we can kind of balance that as we go through our careers. Okay, well, Dave, this has been really fun, and I've enjoyed the conversation. I feel there's definite alignment, and I kind of enjoy it, and I always enjoy anytime I get to talk to another professional who does stuff that is, I would say parallel to the work I do, but on different pathways. And I think that I encourage people to continue to reach out to other people doing similar stuff, because there's differences and similarities. And I think that that's how we get better as professionals.
yeah,
One thing I'm going to add as well is I'm going to link in this description all the links to all of Dave's YouTube videos and socials. Last thing I'll say before we wrap is I appreciated there was a video you posted about 3 months ago on YouTube where you were talking about your mental struggles recently and some of the anxiety, stresses, and all those kind of things. And I just want to uh, thank you for that, because I also am someone who has experienced and struggles with anxiety. I do therapy myself, and I think that we, whether we like to consider this, we might individually have imposter syndrome about people paying attention to the stuff we say, but we are role models for the next gen of folks coming in, and I think it's really important. And I appreciated that you were sharing so honestly what's happening.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I think it's just important to be open and honest about these things. It's it's not always super easy and super cool for everybody all the time, and I think that that's one of the real uh, pitfalls of social media in general, is that a lot of people have a very false sense of how things are sometimes. So yeah, it was important for me to share, and I think it just sort of it wasn't that I needed any special attention or anything. It's just, I just needed. It's just nice to get things off your chest sometimes and just be
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, this is what's happening, and this is why I'm maybe not doing as many videos or all these things. So